Welcome to Question It, the podcast where we rethink health, wellness, and personal growth. I'm Kevin, your host, chief inquisitor, and sometimes guinea pig, exploring fresh paths to a better life. Let's dive into today's episode and get started. Hey there, welcome to another episode of Question It. I'm really excited about today's episode because for the first time, I feel like I'm really starting to get into the core of what I want this podcast to really dive into. My real goal, again, is to try and help make your life, my life, everyone's life a little easier and happier. So in today's episode, we're going to be repurposing a conversation I had about a year ago with Dr. Keith McNally and Mitch Gray. And the three of us had this conversation to discuss how we might change the conversation around mental health. So I really like this episode a lot, and I will link the original video or podcast of Keith McNally's in the show notes. But that episode is an hour long, and that can be a lot to listen to. So what I've done today is I've put that exact episode into Google's Notebook LM, and what I got was a really interesting recap using the AI to really summarize all the things that we were talking about. So I'm really curious what you think. I think this is just a really neat, quick summary way of hearing the great conversation that we had, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and perspective on changing the conversation around mental health and also around behavior. So without further ado, here it is.
Ever feel that pressure to slap on a smile and say, I'm fine, even when honestly you feel like you're on a roller coaster you did not sign up for?
Oh yeah. You just got to paste on that smile.
Right. You're dealing with all these emotions, but you have to just keep it together. We're ditching that facade today. We're going deep diving into what it really means to be, well, mentally and emotionally well.
I am here for ditching the facade. So where are we diving to?
Okay, so we are diving into this YouTube video, and it features Dr. Keith McNally and then experts Kevin Strauss and Mitch Gray.
Okay.
And these guys, they spent over 2 decades, both of them combined, getting to the core of human behavior, mental well-being, all of that.
Okay.
And they don't just give the typical advice. They actually challenge us to rethink how we even define mental health.
Oh, wow.
Right? Challenging the definition itself. Are we even speaking the same language when we use these terms, which I love?
Yeah.
To kick things off, Kevin uses this analogy of a car with 4 tires.
Okay, I'm listening. Love a good analogy.
So each tire, right, represents a different aspect of our well-being.
Yeah.
You've got physical, emotional, mental, spiritual.
Mm.
And his point is, you can't just focus on inflating one tire and expect that car to run smoothly.
Yeah.
That
makes sense. It's like neglecting your emotional health, and then you're wondering why you feel so burnt out, even if you're going to the gym every day, you're physically healthy.
Yes, exactly. That's where these alternative definitions come in.
Okay.
So he defines emotional health as the ability to give and receive love, connection, belonging.
Yeah.
It's not just about being happy all the time.
Right.
It's really our capacity for healthy emotional engagement.
Right. So not avoiding negative emotions altogether, but navigating them in a way that you're still connecting authentically.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And then we have mental health, which he defines as, being able to focus, concentrate, think clearly, actually use your brain power. But this is where it gets interesting. Mitch, the other expert, chimes in and reminds us that while having these definitions is super helpful, we have to remember that everyone's experience is totally unique.
Yeah, you can't just lump everyone into these boxes. What works for one person may not work for another.
Totally. And this actually reminded me of that moment in the video where Mitch talks about a time when I was struggling, I was feeling super overwhelmed and burnt out, and just having him listen and validate how I was feeling without trying to fix it. It just made such a difference.
There's so much power in just feeling heard and understood, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes that's all we need to keep going.
That's it.
Yeah, it's he provided that emotional support. He was that spare tire.
Yes.
To help you keep going until you could get a new tire.
Yes. And that perfectly brings it back to, Kevin's point about all aspects of well-being being interconnected. It wasn't about solving the external problem in that moment. It was about taking care of that emotional tire as well.
It really is amazing.
Like just feeling seen.
How that can help you keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that leads perfectly into the next part of their discussion, which is about taking action.
Right.
You know, it's one thing to like redefine terms.
Right.
It's a whole other thing to actually change the way we're living and interacting with each other.
Absolutely.
So in the video, I actually ask Mitch, what can we do differently to cultivate genuine well-being? Like both for ourselves and for those around us.
Okay, so moving from understanding to action,
Yeah.
what did he have to say?
Well, his answer is really interesting
Okay.
because it's personal, but it's also super insightful.
Mm.
He actually starts talking about how he concealed his own mental health struggles for years.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
He like hid his struggles? That's so surprising, especially with the work that he does.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Someone with his expertise, all the work he does to help others.
Right.
Like he felt like he couldn't even be honest about what he was going through.
Wow.
He talks about this pressure to maintain a certain image, a certain status.
Yeah.
Like admitting vulnerability just felt impossible.
It's a huge reality check,
Right.
especially for someone who works in that field.
Yeah.
Makes you think like, what kind of pressure are we all under
Right.
to have it all together?
Yes.
Even when we're really struggling.
And you know what's interesting is Mitch points out that this need for status, this constant chasing after external validation,
Yeah.
it's often at the root of so much suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're all in this hamster wheel
Right.
trying to achieve and acquire,
Mm-hmm.
but it never quite leads to lasting happiness.
No, never.
So it makes you wonder,
It does.
how much of our own behavior,
Yeah.
do you know the listener's behavior, is driven by this need for external validation?
It's a good question to ask yourself.
Right. It's definitely something to think about.
Definitely.
So if this chase for external validation is part of the problem,
Right.
what does Mitch say we should do instead?
Yeah. What's the alternative?
His call to action is pretty powerful.
Okay.
It's like we need to dismantle these illusions.
Okay.
Stop buying into the idea that our worth is tied to things like money or status.
Okay.
Instead, he says we need to focus on creating a culture of validation,
Yes.
facilitation, and affirmation.
I love that.
Right.
Imagine a world where we're celebrating each other's successes,
Yes.
offering support during challenges,
Yes.
encouraging growth, but like without judgment. It's
Yeah.
like this feeling of we're all in this together
Right.
rather than this pressure to be perfect.
Exactly. And you know what's cool?
What's that?
This aligns perfectly with what Kevin talks about,
Okay.
which is really about meeting our basic human needs, both physical and the emotional.
Yeah.
He says just like we need air, water, and food to survive,
Right.
we need love connection, a sense of belonging to really thrive.
It seems so obvious when you say it like that,
Right.
but it's so easy to forget.
It is.
We get so caught up in our physical needs.
Yeah.
Like, I got to eat right, I got to exercise.
Right.
But we forget about those emotional needs.
Yeah. And that's where things get really interesting,
Okay, tell me more.
because Kevin talks about how this primal need to be loved and valued can actually drive a lot of the behaviors that we often label as mental illness.
Whoa. Okay, so explain that.
He shares these really powerful examples
Right.
of how everything from childhood experiences to societal messages, even our everyday interactions,
Yeah.
can shape our beliefs and behaviors in ways that we may not even realize.
Okay, I'm hooked. Give me an example.
He talks about how a child who grows up constantly being criticized
Okay.
might develop this deep-seated belief that they're not good enough.
Right.
And then as adults,
Yeah. They might overwork themselves.
oh yeah,
Constantly seeking approval from others because that's the only way they've learned to feel valued.
that's like a subconscious thing.
Right.
It's not like they're choosing to be a workaholic.
Exactly.
It's that they need that validation.
Yes. It's almost like, we're trying to treat the symptom without actually getting to that root cause.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I feel like this deep dive takes a really hopeful turn, because once you understand, like, why someone might be behaving a certain way, it's a lot easier to have compassion and to find those, like, healthier ways to cope.
Totally. So how do we do that?
Right.
How do we move from understanding to action, both on an individual level and as a society?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's especially relevant now, like in a post-COVID world,
Oh, for sure.
because as Kevin points out, like the pandemic didn't necessarily create these societal issues, but it definitely like shined a spotlight on them.
It's like it ripped the Band-Aid off all these unhealed wounds. Exactly.
Where do we even begin?
Well, both Kevin and Mitch offer some really practical advice. Kevin, for example, really emphasizes the importance of creating environments that nurture, like, genuine emotional well-being.
Okay, but what does that even look like? Because it's easy to say, create a supportive environment.
Right.
But how do we actually do that?
Well, he talks about the power of small, everyday actions. Things like, acknowledging and validating each other's feelings, listening with the intent to actually understand, and then replacing judgment with compassion.
And when was the last time you truly felt heard and validated by someone, like without them trying to offer solutions or downplay your experience?
That's the thing. It's not always about fixing things.
Right.
Sometimes it's just about creating that safe space for someone to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And to share their struggles without fear of being judged.
Yeah. And to your point, it's not just about creating that space for others, but for ourselves as well, which Mitch talks about in the video. He actually shares some of his own, what he calls daily anchors.
Oh, I like that.
There's little things he does consistently to kind of cultivate that emotional resilience.
Yeah, he talks about getting out of bed every day.
Yeah.
Even when it's hard.
Oh, yeah.
Reading, moving his body, doing acts of service for others, and then taking some time for meditation.
It's a good reminder that even these small, consistent actions can make a world of difference.
Yeah.
It's about showing up for ourselves, even when we don't feel like it, and creating a life that feels both meaningful and fulfilling.
I love that.
One step at a time. And, it brings us back to that thought-provoking question that they leave us with at the end of the video.
Which is?
If our current approach to mental health often involves, labeling and medicating symptoms,
Right.
What would it look like if we actually addressed the root causes?
The why.
The why. Those unmet needs, societal pressures, those emotional wounds that are really driving so much of our behavior.
It really makes you think, what would a world look like where emotional well-being wasn't just this, aspiration,
Right.
but a lived reality?
Something that, I think we all want. To feel truly seen, heard, supported.
Absolutely. And if this conversation has resonated with you at all, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Maybe journal about it, share this episode with a friend, or just take a few moments to really reflect on how you can cultivate more emotional well-being in your own life and in your interactions with others.
Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together, right?
We are.
And creating a world where mental and emotional health are valued, nurtured. I mean, that's a goal worth striving for.
Couldn't agree more.
To more emotionally well lives.
Cheers to that.
Okay, so what did you think of AI's interpretation and summary of an hour-long conversation? It only took about 10 minutes, and I actually think it was a pretty good summary of some of the definitions and ideas that I was sharing and some of the perspective and some of the tools and approaches that Mitch was sharing that you can use in your life and get started today to hopefully make your life easier and happier. So go to the show notes, please, and join this episode's Uchi Tribe, where we can dig into some private conversation based on questions that I've come up with. A couple of sample questions are there in the show notes, and we can dig into this conversation a little bit deeper with you, the listeners, using the free Uchi app. So I hope you'll do that. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please give it a 5-star review wherever you happen to enjoy your podcast. And I hope we'll see you again on the next episode. Until then, peace, love, and connect. Thanks for joining me on Question It. Remember, growth happens outside your comfort zone. So keep experimenting and embracing change. If you enjoyed this episode, connect with me in the show notes, leave a 5-star review, and request to join this episode's Uchi Tribe. Until next time, peace, love, and connect.